Cargill, and Sass Milk. Our bronze sponsors: Goodlands Environmental Incorporated, Sass Goats, Terralogic, and Cherry Insurance. Thank you all for supporting the profession of agrology. Before we start the convention, some housekeeping points for everyone. Prairieland Park is providing the technical support for this event. If you're having technical problems, please call them at 306-931-7149. This info will be in the Q&A. Audio and video functions have been disconnected for the participants. There will be time for questions at the end of each presentation, and use the Q&A to contribute questions or discussion. There will be no verbal component to the Q&A. Articling agrologists using this convention and AGM as a milestone must attend all of the sessions. Send your milestone checklist to info@sia.sk.ca, all in lowercase, and it will be signed and returned to you once your attendance is checked and verified. With that, I would like to welcome everyone to day one of the 2026 SIA Annual Convention. And at this time, I would welcome Dina Delday, PAG, to introduce our first speaker. Enjoy the convention, everyone.
Thanks, David. Welcome, everybody. So glad to see everyone online early this morning. Sorry, excuse me. My cough is coming through. So this morning we have Ian Cook joining us first thing. I am Dina Delday. I'm a professional agrologist, and I work in the environmental field, and I'm a provincial councillor for the Northwest Branch. I'm pleased to announce Ian Cook, who is also a professional agrologist, and his session today is called Win-Win Pathways for Bird Conservation in Agriculture Working Landscape. Ian is a grassland conservation manager for Birds Canada. Ian's work largely focuses on finding solutions for conserving birds that rely on the Canadian agriculture working landscape. He also works as a part of a team to find economic solutions to evolve an agriculture system that conserves birds while sustaining the livelihoods of people on the land. He's received his Bachelor of Science in Agriculture. He, as earlier mentioned, he's also a professional agrologist and a certified crop advisor. Thank you again, Ian, for joining us today at the SIA, and I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Dina. I'll just get my screen shared here and I was going to share my sound from my presentation, but let's see whether I can go. Okay, I think I'm ready to go now. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the rest of the talks today. So I work for an organization called Birds Canada. We're a national organization that is focused on the conservation of birds in Canada, and I work as part of a team of about 6 different people here on the Canadian prairies. And again, a lot of our focus is on conserving those birds that rely on the agricultural landscape. More broadly, as an organization, we do a lot of diverse work across Canada, a lot of it focused on science and monitoring to inform conservation, and also doing some on-the-ground conservation work as well. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of that work later on. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about, you may hear quite a bit about birds in your travels, and particularly if you have some interface with the conservation world and so on, there tends to be a lot of focus on birds. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time setting the scene about why there is maybe such a focus on birds and why you hear about it a lot or hear about bird conservation issues quite a bit. And I'm probably a little bit biased, but the first point is that birds are pretty amazing. And here's a pretty typical or a fairly typical scene if you're in either sort of eastern or northern Saskatchewan or western Manitoba and the sort of Aspen Parklandy type areas. And hiding in plain sight, so to speak, are a lot of birds that use a variety of habitats across the agricultural working landscape of the Canadian prairies. And here are just a very small sample of some of the songbirds that use a lot of use the different habitats that we find. Not so there are no raptors or even waterfowl or anything like that are on this slide, but we see that we've got these flycatchers that are using that aspen bluff in the background there. We've got grassland associated birds like bobolinks and western meadowlarks that will use that sort of upland type grassland habitat. And we've got closer to the wetland, we've got a variety of birds like excuse me, Wilson snipe and common yellowthroats with their zoromask that are singing from the cattails, and yellow warblers in the more riparian area using all those shrubs. So they're, as you're out and about in the landscape and you know there are lots of birds that are sort of hiding in plain sight, so to speak. And one of the reasons that you hear about birds so much um, is that they are some of the best connections that we have to wildlife, and they're something that really connect a broad diversity of people, whether you're living rurally or on a farm, or if you're somebody that lives in the city. Birds are pretty ubiquitous, and they're something that a lot of people have a lot of connections to. And in fact, there are over 10 million Canadians that spend money every year to either feed birds or to build houses for them. So that's nearly a quarter of Canadians that spend their hard-earned money on that. And actually, bird watching and is more popular than some activities like camping or watching sports, if you can believe it, or even golfing. So there a tremendous number of Canadians that really care a lot about birds, and I'm sure there are some in the audience here today as well. So so I just wanted to kind of take a moment to talk a little bit about the birds that use the agricultural landscape. And I grew up on a farm. I've worked in agriculture my whole career, but until I started this role, there were sounds that was hearing, but didn't know what birds were making those noises until I started this job. So, in case you're in that same boat and on a pretty frosty morning here, I thought maybe I might remind us all a little bit what summer and spring sounds like, and just play some sounds that you might recognize. And if you were in the same boat that I was in, where you've heard these sounds most of your life but didn't know exactly what was making them, I thought it might be kind of a fun activity to kick off the conference, to just listen to some birds and see if you recognize these. And if you know what's making the noise, then you get an extra point. But this is a sound that really reminds me of a summer evening. So that's making that noise is a Wilson snipe. So this sort of strange looking shorebird that we get across the prairies, and tends to be in sort of those wet sort of grassland areas that tend to be sort of seasonally wet. They flood in the spring, and that's where they really like to hang out. And just an interesting point about this bird is that winnowing noise is a noise that the males make when they're trying to attract mates or they stake out their territory. But that noise is not something that they make from their strange long beak. It's not a vocalization. It's the noise of wind going through their tail feathers as they make this sort of steep dive as they're doing their display. So I thought that was sort of something interesting to share. So that's a noise that I'm hoping these are coming through okay. I'm not monitoring the Q&A, but I'm hoping that those noises are coming through. But I grew up certainly thinking that that was just a grasshopper or a cricket of some kind, but it's actually this kind of neat looking or cute but drab songbird called a clay-colored sparrow that tends to be nesting in the shrub areas, either in sort of shrubby grasslands or even in those riparian areas or marginal areas in crop fields. And then the last one. So this might be something that's familiar to folks that are in, again, those aspen parkland or really pothole areas, particularly in wet years. We see a lot, or we hear a lot of these birds they're called sora, and they're kind of a strange looking chicken thing that you barely ever see. They tend to be in those, those wetlands that have cattails and other emergent vegetation, and they can be really, really abundant in those wet years. But again, something that I grew up and never knew what the heck it was, and it's just sort of I find it a very exciting thing to be able to wander around in landscapes and know what's surrounding me. So I hope that was maybe a nice reminder of some summer days here as we hopefully are rounding the corner into spring. So so we kind of hopefully have established that birds are pretty neat. And the second reason that you hear a lot about birds is that they make pretty good environmental indicators. So birds are really widespread. They occupy almost every habitat type that we have in North America and in Canada. They're also really well studied, so we know a lot about what their preferences are. We know a lot about their trends. We know a lot about what makes them tick, where they go, all those sorts of things. So that makes them really well studied. And they're also really mobile and responsive to change. So they have wings and they can use them, and they do use them. So if they have habitat conditions that they don't like, or then they just move on. And combine that with that they come back and they migrate every year. If they come back and they see things have changed, well, they just don't recognize that as breeding habitat anymore, and they move on, or they don't breed. And so these things make birds quite good environmental indicators, because they exist in all sorts of different places within the food chain and all sorts of different habitats. We know a lot about them, and we know that they're responsive. So because birds are so well studied, and because of all those things, when we see trends of different groups of birds, we can learn a lot from those trends about what's going on in the landscape. So this is a graph of bird population change since 1970. So around 1970 is when a lot of long-term monitoring programs began. So that's why we kind of use that as the starting point for a lot of bird monitoring trends. So we can see some successes on this graph. We can see that for waterfowl, birds of prey, wetland birds, their populations are generally increasing. And so that's the result of, the discontinuation of the use of DDT, as well as habitat protections for wetlands, and some of the good work that's been going on in the conservation and agricultural world since that time has led to increases in waterfowl and wetland birds and birds of prey. However, we also see that there are groups of birds that do rely on the agricultural landscape that are declining quite sharply. So shorebirds use the prairie landscape, in particular the wetlands, as a place to rest and refuel, or to raise their young. We also have aerial insectivores. So these are birds that, like purple martins or swallows, that catch insects while they're flying around. And they tend to really rely on insects that are coming out of those wetlands. And we have a lot of them on the Canadian prairies, and they're declining quite rapidly too, although we do see some stabilization there, which is good. And then, of course, grassland birds that have seen the largest declines since 1970, having lost a full 2/3 of their population since that time. So if we dig into, excuse me, grassland bird declines a little bit, we can see that those habitat specialists, those native grassland specialists, are declining the fastest, and that's really driven by a lot of the loss of native grassland that we've seen across the Canadian prairies. And to be perfectly honest with you, if we don't see some change for some of those species that are in that group, there's a pretty good chance that by the time my 4-year-old daughter is my age, she won't be able to see some of those species that are in that group in Canada any longer. But we also see that there are some worrying trends with those more generalist type of birds that are in the agricultural landscape as well. So these are birds that aren't necessarily as picky as some of those native grassland birds, but they can kind of make a living in some smaller grasslands or even on the margins of crop fields. But even those we can see are declining quite rapidly. So this all together, knowing that birds are pretty good indicators, can help us understand what's going on in our agricultural landscape and what the threats are, and that there may be some portions of our agricultural landscape that aren't as ecologically functional as they were 50 years ago. So the last thing that why you might hear quite a bit about birds and why birds do make good environmental indicators is that they're relatively easy to study. We sort of put a star beside easy and cheap to study, but they do tend to lend themselves pretty well. And part of it is because they sing to communicate. They are essentially advertising their presence. They advertise for potential mates. They advertise their fitness. So it's a bird that's singing over and over and lots is advertising that, hey, I'm in better shape than everybody else. And they also establish territories by making noises, saying that this is my area. Everybody else stay out. So if we're there at the right time of the year, all we really need to do is to listen, and they're essentially yelling out their names. And there aren't a whole lot of things in the world where you can count and monitor without ever necessarily laying eyes on them, because birds are singing. We can count them and get good estimates of how many birds are there and where they are without even ever seeing them. So that's sort of why birds. And then, so why the Canadian prairie? Why are they so important? Two birds. So this is from a website called the Migration Explorer. And if you have a chance to play around with this, it is a pretty cool website to play around with. So this is a map generated from data that's from tracking devices that have been placed on birds. And all of these different colored lines and points are those birds, those individual birds' flight paths that they've made as they migrate back and forth from their wintering grounds to the breeding grounds. So we can see that we've got, in the green, we've got land birds that are using it. The Canadian prairies, we've got some raptors that definitely are using it, lots of shorebirds, lots of water birds, lots of waterfowl that make their way through the Canadian prairies. And the Canadian prairies often sort of represent a bit of an hourglass where have lots of birds that maybe winter down in the eastern part of the United States or even further south, and birds that winter down in the western part tend to kind of come up through the Central Flyway and up through the Canadian prairies because it's such rich habitats for them to either nest or to stop and refuel. And it's actually thought that the Canadian prairies are important to more bird species than any other ecosystem in North America. So the Canadian prairies are tremendously important for birds. And some of them undertake tremendous migration. So this is a bobolink. Some of you might be familiar with it. Tends to be kind of a eastern prairies sort of bird, and they're a grassland associated bird, and they undertake a massive migration. They go 12,500 miles every year, make a round trip every year. So they're going from the Canadian prairies and eastern Canada all the way down to southern Brazil and northern Argentina. But why do they bother doing that? And the reason is food. In spring and summer here in our northern latitudes, we have this explosion of insects, like these clouds of midges that you maybe have seen while you're driving around Saskatchewan. And the reason that they're coming here then, and the reason that some of these birds have decided that this is the best place on the planet to raise their kids is because of these insects. They have amino acids, proteins, fats that are really important, especially when they're laying their eggs and when they're raising their kids. And it helps their kids get grown up and ready for another migration really quickly. And that's the main reason why these birds are undertaking long and often very dangerous migrations. So even birds that may eat seeds or fruit in the winter, when they come here on the Canadian prairies, almost all of them are eating insects when they're here because that's the most nutritious and for their kids. Okay, so I talked about why birds are sort of important. I'm now going to, and why you hear a lot about birds. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, how does this fit in with agriculture and where are some of the win-wins, I suppose. So there is a growing body of evidence that the resilience and sustainability of Canadian agriculture can be really benefited by embedding birds and biodiversity and natural cover and perennial cover into our agricultural working landscape. So there's an estimated 7 million acres of cropland that's marginal and very often, as many of you will probably know, unprofitable. And I before I came to Birds Canada, I worked as an advisor, particularly in that sort of precision realm. So I know that there are often barriers to seeding down marginal areas, but there are also a lot of opportunities there. And I think as agrologists, we can play a role in helping producers make some decisions around putting those areas to work in different ways and help to whether there are small areas that are prone to salinity or and have kochia growing in them, or whether they're larger areas that are prone to flood or drought. Reestablishing that perennial cover on those places can have a lot of benefit for birds in the form of providing habitat, buffering nutrient loading or pesticide contamination into the wetlands and benefiting those insects that the birds rely on. And I think offers sort of a win-win for both bird conservation and agricultural production in improving the resilience and sustainability of our agricultural production, but also to providing habitat and food sources for those birds. So just a quick note that I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the programming that's available to producers and some resources there, but I wanted to take the opportunity to just say that there are a number of good programs, including Ducks Unlimited's Marginal Areas program, but also the Prairie Precision Sustainability Network that has a program available to provide financial support and decision supports on seeding down marginal areas and then researching the effects of that. So it's a really great program from the University of Saskatchewan and involving a number of different partners. So I know that they're typically looking for producers to participate in that. And if we have anybody that's listening in from Manitoba, I know they're particularly looking for producers there. But so I think there's an opportunity for some win-win things going on with incorporating bird conservation into our agricultural landscape. And to kind of beat a dead horse a little bit on this, but birds do play, they're not just good environmental indicators, they also play an essential role in and of themselves. And they help to cycle nutrients. They play a role in pollination. and they also, they keep insects down a little bit, but we know that, they're eating those insects and they're living and dying here on the Canadian prairies. Sometimes they're going south, and helps to cycle nutrients across different landscapes. And of course, they are good indicators of ecosystem health. And then again, you know, it, going back to one of my first slides there, they are something that can be quite uplifting. And I think a lot of people connect, and having a landscape without birds, I think, would be a bit depressing. If you're like me, first thing in the spring when we hear those birds, it's something that can kind of get me out of a winter funk. So it's a I think birds play an important role in that way too. I'm showing this chart quickly again, just to, touch on a couple of points where, we do have birds that are doing, much better than they had in the past, but we do again have these birds that are declining. And a lot of that is, despite this, we have this urgent need to address bird and loss in our agricultural system. Right now, our agri-food system doesn't do a great job of recognizing are incorporating birds and biodiversity into our agricultural and economic system. However, we know that economics is the primary factor in producers' decision making, and that farmers and ranchers are paid for the commodities that they produce. They're paid for tons of wheat and pounds of beef. So when producers don't have a direct economic benefit for conserving birds and biodiversity, it does make it difficult for agricultural producers to incorporate biodiversity into their management decisions. And ultimately, this encourages things that are causing the loss of birds and biodiversity in the agricultural working landscape. So a lot of our work on the Canadian prairies is focused on how do we address these systemic economic issues that are at the root cause of grassland bird and other bird population declines. And I think it's just recognizing that agriculture has done amazing things. If we look at yields, even in my lifetime, the progress that we've made there is incredible. But the challenge now is how do we sustain these production achievements in a way that has less impact on the environment, or even better, actively recovers nature and biodiversity while sustaining the livelihoods of the people on the land. So we're looking at ways that we can help do that. So we talked about how birds are good environmental indicators in working landscapes. So we thought if one of the roles that we could play, if we could do a good job of measuring and communicating the impact that a farm or ranch has on bird conservation, and communicating that to a number of different stakeholders, including to consumers, could we then start to incorporate bird conservation more into our agricultural economic system? Um, so our work is really focused on something called, or one of the things that we're focused on is something called the Bird Friendliness Index, and using this to measure those impacts at a farm level. And then by doing that, enable some different tools that can increase the economic viability of those farms and ranches that are providing positive bird and biodiversity conservation outcomes. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on how the Bird Friendliness Index is measured, but at broad strokes, it's essentially considers two inputs: how many birds are on a farm, so how many birds per hectare, and then the conservation status of those birds. And we make a comparison of the good bird community on the farm, and then we compare that to the bird community that's in the surrounding landscape. And this comparison between the how many birds are there and the conservation value of the birds that are there on a farm compared to the surrounding landscape gives us a score between 0 and 1, and a value above 0.5 means that generally that operation is providing above average benefits to birds in their region. So we think in this way, this is a fairly easy to understand metric, and that's scientifically rigorous, that can maybe do a really good job at communicating the impact that individual farm or ranch is having, so that we can enable some different financial or risk management or other sorts of programs that would provide some direct benefit, economic benefit to those producers for providing those services to bird conservation. So we actually do have a pilot where we're putting some rubber on the road towards this idea. So we're partnered with the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation in Saskatchewan, and the way on a pilot where we're paying producers based on their bird friendliness index score. So the way that this works is that producers that signed a habitat management agreement or a restoration agreement with the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation were then eligible to participate in our outcomes-based incentive pilot based on the bird friendliness index. So we go out and we measure birds on the farms and ranches to determine a bird friendliness index score, and then participants receive a payment based on their achievements of the bird friendliness index. So once they're above 0.5, they're eligible for a payment. So we're learning a lot from that pilot. We're talking to producers about what they like about the program, what they don't like about the program, and just generally learning about this sort of new way of going about conservation that we hope that can be quite complementary to the programs that are out there. And while there are a number of ways that are being developed to measure biodiversity, we think that the bird friendliness index can play a good role in, again, helping to recover birds in our ag landscape while also sustaining the livelihoods of the people on the landscape, because it kind of balances some of the scientific rigor with scalability, and also with the connection with or leveraging the resonance that birds have. And hopefully by using birds as indicators and as of environmental health, we can reward producers for the contribution they're making, and making this a win all around for everyone. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on, or a couple of things that I wanted to touch on, is that this is a results-based approach or an outcomes-based approach to conservation, which we think can be complementary to some of the other programs that are available out there, because it's a non-prescriptive approach that gives producers a lot of agency on how they want to achieve conservation goals. And it tends to align with the way that producers approach the rest of their operation. Producers set goals. I want my calves to weigh this much, or I want to achieve this this production on my grain crops. Similarly, they can set a goal. I want to score this score on the bird friendliness index. They track results. How much did my calves weigh? What did I yield on that field? Okay, similarly, they can look at what their bird friendliness index score and evaluate from there, and then adapt based on those outcomes. How can I change my management so that I can achieve both my production goals and my bird conservation goals, and then choose the way to achieve those goals that best fit their operation. And this outcomes-based approach, again, I think can fit quite well within the greater conservation programming that's out there, and there are a lot of great programs. And by providing that direct economic benefit for contributing to bird conservation and all of the environmental goods and services that go along with birds, we think that this can represent a real win-win for everybody: producers, birds, and of course society at large. So, and then shifting gears again a little bit here, I wanted to touch on some things that as agrologists we can maybe do to help the producers that we work with on on helping birds in the agricultural landscape. So one of the challenges that we recognized was that there are a number of good programs that exist out there, but it can be time consuming or difficult for producers to find which ones might suit their needs. So we compiled the conservation programs that are available to prairie farmers and ranchers into a document that was hopefully pretty easy to use. So if you have a quick trigger finger, you can scan the QR code there, and that's going to take you to the Prairie Conservation Incentives Guide. And this contains a bunch of different programs and funding sources that are available to producers to either conserve, enhance, or restore prairie habitats. So within the guide, you'll find that there are programs that operate across the 3 prairie provinces under the national programs, and then there are also programs specific to each province, including Saskatchewan. And so, for example, we have the Saskatchewan Stockgrowers Foundation programming there. Excuse me. The last update that we did on this was 2024. So there might be some programs that are a bit out of date, but by and large, it should point you in the best general direction for finding these programs. And there should be enough information on there to provide, with some information about what level of commitment is required, what the level of compensation is, so that you or your producers that you work with can make some determination on whether this program would fit for them or not. From that incentives guide, there's actually been a bit of an evolution where the Nature Conservancy of Canada and Corvus Centre for Conservation worked with Birds Canada to build an online tool called the Conservation Incentive Finder. So this is essentially building a web tool based on the guide that's actually more comprehensive and has a lot more tools. So if you just as to kind of walk through it a little bit, down the side here, you can choose your province, and then you can choose a whole list. Wasn't able to show them all, but there are a number of different filters that you can use to find the right program for you. So if I'm a producer in Saskatchewan and I'm just generally interested in providing more wildlife habitat, I can click those 2 things, and it's going to give me a whole list of programs that would help me achieve my goals. So maybe the Forage Incentive Program from Ducks Unlimited catches my eye. I can click on that and learn more. And again, it's going to give me a number of or enough information that I can make a pretty informed decision about whether this program is right for me or not. And so this is another option for yourselves or producers to find conservation programming. So there are 2 options available to folks on the prairies for finding different programs. You have the Conservation Incentive Finder on the right-hand side. Again, this is a more comprehensive tool that's more often updated. But I also know that online tools can have sometimes a bit of a learning curve. So if you're somebody that prefers essentially just a pamphlet and wants to read through it, the incentives guide on the left-hand side is pretty straightforward. It's a little less comprehensive, a little updated, a little less often, but it's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So 2 options for you. And then I wanted to kind of end on just letting you know, if you are out and about and you are curious about birds that you're seeing or hearing as you're going across the landscape, there's a great tool called the Merlin Bird ID app. It's a free app that you can download to your phone, and it has built-in sound ID that has gotten really good over the years. So if you're hearing a bird and you're not sure what it is, you hold your phone up, it's going to listen, and it's going to provide you a list of likely species that it could be. So it's a really, really neat tool, and I mean, has helped me to learn birds by ear. Yeah, amazingly, well. So the second way that you can use this is if you see a bird and it's not singing, but you want to know what it is. You can walk you through step by step on Okay, and where the bird is, when you saw it, what size it is, all those sorts of things. And it will give you then a list of birds that it might be, and again, help you identify that bird. And just to help you get more attuned to the birds that are throughout the as that you encounter throughout the agricultural landscape as you're working out there. So I highly recommend the Merlin Bird ID app. It's really, really useful. And so I wanted to wrap up with I talked a bit about some of the bad news that are facing birds in the agricultural landscape and the declines, but I wanted to end on some of the good news. And, coming from the State of Canada's Birds Report, we can see that when we understand a problem and we take deliberate and effective action, we can do really tremendous things for bird conservation. So for raptors, we collectively recognized that, DDT was really affecting these birds of prey. And together with conservation and agriculture, we quit using that chemical, and the birds of prey have rebounded amazingly. Many of you might notice that you see more bald eagles out on the landscape than you used to. I certainly see them more than when I was a kid, and that's because there just are more of them. Those populations are starting to rebound after the discontinuation of the use of DDT. We also see that those waterfowl and wetland birds had a lot of hunting from, or had a lot of pressure from hunting and from wetland losses earlier in the 20th century. But we, put into hunting regulations. There was international investment into wetland conservation. The agriculture community has been really good at conserving wetlands, and that's been really effective to helping to recover these birds. And while they're definitely within these groups, there are individual species that are still declining. The crux of this is that earlier in the 20th century, some of these birds were on their way to extinction. And now they're some of the best conservation success stories in North America. So I wanted to end by just saying, while the threats facing grassland birds and other birds that rely on the ag landscape are many and complex, we understand them really well. And if we set our minds to it and we work together, we can keep grassland birds and these other birds from disappearing in Canada. And I think if we work together towards an ag system that actively conserves birds and biodiversity, we can also sustain the livelihoods of the people on the land. And together we can kind of create a prairie ag working landscape that's teeming with life, both human life and bird life, which is the ultimate win-win. And with that, I'll end and just say thank you to all of our partners and sponsors that make our work possible. And thank you to you all for inviting me. And I look forward to any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ian.